Julian Vance was 41, and for 8 years his mother-in-law had introduced him merely as Clara's husband. She never used his given name. It was always a category, delivered with the faint, tight-lipped hesitation of a woman who firmly believed her daughter had compromised, yet lacked the basic decency to hide it. Beatrice Sterling had laid her cards on the table during a Thanksgiving dinner 6 years ago. She waited until she thought Julian was outside checking the grill, then announced to her guests that Clara had shackled herself to a blue-collar dreamer. A man who spent his 30s playing in the dirt, Beatrice had declared, would spend his 50s borrowing money to survive. She said he would die with rough hands and absolutely nothing to his name. My sister Elena had told him everything before dessert was even served. Julian hadn't brought it up. Not that night. Not ever. Clara had been meticulously drafting her escape route for 16 months before Julian stumbled onto the first wire transfer. She had quietly bled $85,000 out of what he thought were their joint savings, burying it in a private trust her firm's senior partner had structured. She told Beatrice the plan before she told anyone else, and Beatrice practically applauded. What neither woman had bothered to ask, not across 8 long holiday dinners, polite sneers, and condescending sighs, was what Julian actually did when he left the house at dawn and returned after dark. A year after the divorce ink finally dried, Beatrice Sterling pushed her way through the heavy glass doors of Horizon Development Group in downtown Chicago. She needed a massive structural and financial bailout for her failing historic estate. She held a referral from an elite city planner, but the towering bronze letters behind the reception desk matched the planner's contact. The name on the wall was entirely different. She stopped breathing the second she recognized it.
The morning light in Julian's kitchen always hit the custom oak island first. He had framed that kitchen himself when he gutted the property 4 years ago. Most days he was awake by 5, nursing a black coffee and reviewing structural blueprints on his iPad while the Chicago suburbs slowly hummed to life. Julian was a structural engineer. He looked at heavy, massive things for a living. He studied weight, tension, and the invisible fractures that grew over decades until a foundation finally snapped. He knew perfectly well that this wasn't just about buildings. His grandfather had cornered him in a dusty workshop years ago when Julian was a broke engineering apprentice running on cheap diner food and sheer stubbornness. The old man had handed him a heavy steel wrench, locked eyes with him, and said, "Listen to me. A man who understands how foundations crack understands how people break. You just have to shut your mouth and watch the stress points." Julian hadn't grasped the weight of that advice in his 20s. He understood it in his bones now. The house they lived in was a sprawling mid-century modern that Julian bought cheap and rebuilt from the studs. New load-bearing beams, custom glasswork, a reinforced retaining wall he poured by hand. Clara found his physical labor charming at first. Eventually, she just found it embarrassing. To her, an educated man choosing to sweat in the yard was a glitch in the social matrix she couldn't accept. Julian kept his workspace in the converted barn out back. Every tool had a home. And hidden behind the heavy pegboard, inside a recessed floor safe Clara didn't even know existed, was a heavy leather binder. It held the Articles of Incorporation for Horizon Development Group. He had launched the firm 7 years ago with 2 silent backers. Today, it was a regional powerhouse with 42 lead engineers and a profit margin his wealth manager routinely described as obscene. Clara knew he had a cramped office somewhere downtown. She had absolutely no idea he owned the entire 14-story building. He first noticed her at a charity gala for local developers. She was finishing her final year of law school, sharp, fast-talking, and carrying herself with the icy confidence of someone who never had to beg for a seat at the table. Julian liked her fire. He liked that she didn't apologize for taking up space. They tied the knot 2 years later,
At the rehearsal dinner, Beatrice had cornered the groomsmen and loudly proclaimed that her daughter's dress was the only decent thing about the entire arrangement. Beatrice had a rigid script for how the world should work. That script did not include a 32-year-old man who still wore steel-toed boots to meetings. She made Julian feel her disdain, weaponizing her politeness the way old money always does, smiling at him while sliding the knife between his ribs. When his sister Elena texted him Beatrice's Thanksgiving insults the following morning, the apology in her message was heavy. She felt he had a right to know. Julian read the text. He locked his phone screen. Then he picked up his hard hat and went to work. He spent the next 6 years building an empire in absolute silence. Clara came hurrying down the stairs that late November morning, already dressed for court. She was a blur of motion, grabbing her travel mug, pinning her phone between her ear and shoulder. She leaned in, pressed a distracted kiss against his jaw without even looking at him, and grabbed her car keys. "Are you at the West Side site today or the main office?" she asked, her voice tight with her own schedule. She didn't wait for an answer. She just walked out the door, leaving him sitting in the quiet house he owned, drinking money she couldn't comprehend.
He told her the West Side site. Clara gave a vague nod, turning her back to the custom cabinets to type something on her screen with an intensity that a casual morning text rarely demanded. That was when he caught it. Just the matte black edge of a second phone slipping out of her tailored blazer pocket. It had a cheap, rubbery case, nothing like the monogrammed leather she normally carried. He didn't blink. He just finished his coffee and left. The first real tremor hit that same afternoon. When Julian walked through the front door at 6, a thick ivory envelope was sitting dead center on the marble island. It bore the letterhead of a downtown family law practice. The flap was torn open, left face up. It was the exact way someone leaves a document when they've stopped caring if you see it, or when they want you to panic. He stood in the entryway, still wearing his steel-toed boots, and read the first page. It wasn't a divorce petition yet. It was a formal request for asset discovery. Someone was trying to map out his net worth. He didn't throw a tantrum. He didn't confront her. Julian drove back to his workshop, locked the heavy steel door, and fired up his desktop. He built high-rises for a living. He knew that when a foundation was sinking, the dirt always left a trail. He started with the joint savings accounts. Pulling 2 years of transaction logs, he spread the printed sheets across his drafting table. The math was right there. Over 16 months, Clara had siphoned exactly $85,000 out of their shared cash. The withdrawals were clinical. 10,000 here, 4,000 there, small enough to dodge the bank's automatic fraud triggers, but consistent enough to bleed the account dry. Julian checked the routing numbers 3 times. Then he scanned every single document, encrypted the files, and dumped them onto an offshore server. His pulse barely spiked.
The burner phone had likely been in Clara's rotation for about half a year. Julian pulled up their shared iCloud calendar and started working backward, matching dates like a forensic auditor. He tracked every excuse she had logged for the past 14 months. A 3-day legal seminar in Denver, 4 late-night client dinners in the Loop, a weekend wellness retreat she supposedly took with her sorority sisters. He cross-referenced those exact dates with the timeline of the missing cash. Then he layered in the social events they had attended together. That was when the final piece snapped into place. Marcus Thorne. He was a high-end commercial real estate broker who kept showing up at the same charity galas and firm parties. Julian had noticed Marcus a few months ago. The guy had an artificial, overly polished charm that felt structurally unsound. He laughed a little too loud. Clara smiled at his jokes a fraction of a second too fast. Julian spent Wednesday morning making quiet calls to developers who knew Marcus's actual financial reality, not the facade he projected at cocktail parties. The truth was ugly. Marcus had recently lost 2 anchor clients. His brokerage was actively restructuring to push him out, and his personal debts were suffocating him. Marcus Thorne wasn't just a guy looking for an affair. He was a drowning man looking for a life raft. He wrote it all down in his leather binder. The confirmation came Thursday night. Julian was walking up from the basement when he heard Clara's voice leaking through the cracked door of her home office. Her tone was completely flat, the exact voice she used when negotiating a hostile settlement. He stopped on the stairs and listened. "The preliminary asset search is done," she said into the phone. "Beatrice says we serve him the papers by the end of the month." Julian stood there in the dark for a full minute. Then he quietly backed down the stairs, walked out to his truck, and dialed his attorney.
"Diane," he said when the line clicked open, "I need you at the office tomorrow. Bring the Horizon Development binders. Everything." Diane Russo was a corporate shark who moonlighted in high-stakes family law. She'd spent 2 decades protecting Chicago's elite from having their empires carved up by angry spouses. She was entirely immune to emotional drama, treating divorce as nothing more than a hostile corporate takeover. She sat across from Julian on Friday morning, flipping through the Horizon corporate structure with terrifying speed. "The business is untouchable," she said, tapping the heavy folder. "You established this LLC before the marriage. You never commingled funds. Her lawyer is going to try to claim she supported you while you built this, but this corporate veil is absolute cast iron." Then she picked up the spreadsheet tracking the $85,000. She stopped flipping pages. "This changes the weather, Julian." "How?" he asked. "Because this isn't a standard asset division anymore," Diane said, a sharp, cold smile forming. "This is systematic, premeditated theft. Her lawyer is going to beg her to settle the minute I slide this across the table." She ordered him to gather 5 years of tax returns and told him to keep playing the obvious hard-working husband. Julian didn't need to be told how to wait. A week later, he sat on the back porch of a weathered brick house in the suburbs, drinking bitter coffee with his Uncle Arthur. Arthur was a retired steel worker. He had spent 40 years walking high beams and knew exactly what human greed looked like. Julian laid out the whole story. Arthur just listened, his expression hardening. "I was at that Thanksgiving dinner," Arthur grumbled. "I heard Beatrice call you a broke loser." He pulled out his phone and opened a text thread with his own daughter from a month ago. She had overheard Clara and Beatrice talking at a bridal shower. Beatrice hand-picked Clara's lawyer. Their entire strategy hinged on one fatal assumption. They truly believed Julian didn't have the money to fight back.
"She still thinks you're the kid swinging a hammer for minimum wage," Arthur grumbled, pouring more coffee. "Beatrice locked her opinion of you into place a decade ago and threw away the key." He rested his rough hand on Julian's shoulder. "Your grandfather used to say that a man who knows how foundations settle knows how the whole damn world works." He wasn't talking about concrete, Julian. He was talking about you. Julian took the scenic route back to the house. He needed the quiet. The forensic audit that Diane's private investigator, an ex-IRS bulldog named Vance, completed over the next 10 days was devastating. The $85,000 was tracked down to the penny. Every single wire transfer was cross-referenced against Clara's calendar, her fabricated excuses, and the tollway records Diane had subpoenaed. The paper trail pointed straight to premeditated embezzlement. Vance also dug into Marcus Thorne's background. The regulatory filings from Marcus's failing brokerage painted a pathetic picture. Once his hidden debts were factored in, the man's net worth was heavily in the red. He was under investigation by the State Real Estate Board. Marcus had absolutely nothing to offer Clara except the illusion of success. That Saturday night, Julian stood in the kitchen and cooked his grandfather's heavy beef stew using the stained recipe card he had memorized in his 20s. He and Clara sat down at the custom dining table he had built from reclaimed oak. She talked about a deposition, a colleague's retirement party, and whether they needed to hire a new landscaper. Julian chewed his food. He listened. He nodded when appropriate and cleared the plates when they were done. He built skyscrapers. He knew the difference between a minor settling crack and a catastrophic structural failure. You don't try to patch a collapsing building. You just stand back and let gravity do its job. Preparation was everything.
The mediation took place on a rainy Tuesday morning inside the towering glass offices of Clara's legal counsel. The boardroom overlooked the Chicago River, decorated in the cold, expensive minimalist style favored by people who assumed they were the smartest people in the room. Diane insisted they meet there. She wanted them feeling comfortable right up until the floor fell out. Julian showed up wearing his standard site visit clothes, dark heavy-duty jeans, a plain black Henley, and his steel-toed boots. He sat across the long mahogany table from Clara and her lawyer, a silver-haired shark named Harrington. Julian set Diane's worn leather briefcase flat on the table. Clara looked immaculate and completely serene. Harrington had the relaxed posture of a man who had rehearsed his victory speech the night before. He opened the session by outlining Julian's presumed lifestyle. He painted a picture of a shared domestic life, leaning heavily on the idea that Clara's income had subsidized Julian's struggling contractor business. Harrington used the phrase commingled marital assets 5 times in 10 minutes. He was incredibly thorough. He was also operating from a financial fantasy that didn't include a single piece of paper from Diane's actual filings. Diane sat silently, letting him talk himself into a corner. When Harrington finally paused for a sip of water, she popped the latches on the briefcase. First, she slid the Horizon Development Group operating agreements across the table. They clearly showed the LLC was established years before the wedding, with the equity locked tight and the corporate accounts heavily insulated. She placed the documents down with the casual grace of someone holding a royal flush. Then came the corporate tax returns, then the commercial real estate deeds, 3 massive development sites, 2 owned outright by the LLC, and 1 held in an irrevocable trust Julian had set up before he even bought a ring.
Harrington's confident posture didn't crumble, but his jaw visibly tightened. Then Diane pulled out the withdrawal audit. She dropped 42 heavily annotated pages onto the mahogany table. $85,000 stolen over 16 months. It was systematically structured, heavily documented, and mapped perfectly against the GPS data from Clara's vehicle and the toll pass records. Diane highlighted 7 specific dates where Clara's car was parked within 2 blocks of Marcus Thorne's apartment for hours, aligning exactly what the day's cash went missing. Clara stopped breathing. Diane spoke for exactly 2 minutes. She outlined precisely what the court filings would look like if Clara decided to fight. She used the word fraud twice, applying the exact legal pressure required to make Harrington flinch. She delivered the information without raising her voice, laying out the facts the way a doctor delivers a terminal diagnosis: cold, complete, and final. Harrington cleared his throat and requested a private recess. When they walked back into the room 20 minutes later, Clara stared at Julian. Her face lacked the usual arrogance. She looked like someone who had just realized she had miscalculated the wind speed before jumping off a cliff. She opened her mouth. "I know what you're going to say," Julian interrupted, his voice low and steady. He hadn't yelled once during the entire marriage. He wasn't going to start now. "I want you to understand that I'm not doing this out of spite. I'm here because I built a life with my own 2 hands, and I am walking out of this building with exactly what is mine." Clara whispered that she never meant for things to get this ugly. She said life had gotten confusing.
She said his name with a heavy, desperate weight that he hadn't heard in years. It was far too late.
Harrington placed his palms flat on the table. I believe we can finalize a clean separation agreement today. Diane looked right through him. I agree. You'll find our terms in Section 4. They are non-negotiable. Julian looked at Clara for one long, silent minute. He looked at her the way he looked at a condemned property right before the demolition crew arrived. Julian said, I spent years watching buildings collapse. It's never the sudden earthquake that brings them down. It's the water damage you ignore for a decade. He picked up his jacket. Take care of yourself, Clara. He walked out of the glass boardroom, took the elevator down to the lobby, and stepped out on the wet Chicago pavement. The air was freezing, sharp, and completely his own. 8 months passed, the snow melted, the summer came, and Horizon Development opened a massive new architectural consulting branch in the Gold Coast. At noon on a Wednesday, the front desk manager at the new office buzzed Julian's direct line. A walk-in client was sitting in the lobby asking for an emergency structural assessment. The address on the intake form belonged to Beatrice Sterling. The intake notes mentioned severe foundation cracking and a failing retaining wall that threatened the entire estate. Standard procedure was to route emergency assessments to the nearest available senior engineer. Julian stood in the doorway of his corner office. His receptionist, a sharp-eyed woman named Maria, mentioned that the client had walked in, handed over her paperwork, and practically turned to stone when she looked up and saw the bronze letters on the wall behind the desk. Horizon Development Group, Julian Vance, CEO. Julian walked out to the lobby.
Beatrice Sterling was sitting rigidly in a leather chair, clutching her designer coat. She was in her late 60s, holding on to her manufactured dignity like a shield, but she looked exhausted. She stared at him as he approached. Silence hung between them. "Mrs. Sterling," Julian said, his voice entirely neutral. No gloating, no anger. "Let's look at your property." He reviewed the structural photographs with the same intense focus he gave every project. He explained the soil erosion and the necessary foundation underpinning in clear, grounded terms. He didn't use jargon to confuse her. He just told her the truth about what was broken. He was thorough, professional, and precise. When the consultation was over, Beatrice stood near the glass doors, her coat pulled tight. She looked at him with an expression he had no interest in decoding. "You know what you're doing," she muttered. "I do," he replied, and because he was a man who left his baggage in the past, he added, "I'm assigning your estate to David Miller. He's my best foundation specialist. Maria will set up the site visit." He handed her the file and walked back to his office. By September, Horizon Development had secured 2 massive city contracts. His wealth manager had stopped suggesting investments and started talking about legacy trusts. He'd quietly funded a trade school scholarship for kids from his old neighborhood, naming it after his grandfather. A woman named Sarah had asked him about his grandfather over coffee on his back porch one Sunday morning. Sarah was an architect who spent her days designing spaces meant to last. She listened to his stories without checking her phone or rushing him. She wasn't faking her interest. Julian sat on his porch that evening, watching the autumn wind push through the oak trees he had planted himself. He had built a foundation that could survive anything. He was free.